Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to show and grow a passion for studying God's Word. I'm here today with my friend Jerry Duckett. Jerry and I are going to start a whole new study today and going to do some kind of unique things. We're starting to do a study in the book of John, and this is going to be a unique Bible study in that we're not going to study verse by verse. We're going to study a concept I call word stacking, and we're going to talk about that in a moment or two. And today specifically, we're going to talk about John and why he wrote his gospel. And we'll come to that when we come right back. Welcome back to Bible Study with Friends. When you go through a book of the Bible and you notice that there is a repeated word, that's a theme potentially. And you can go to a concordance and look that word up. And everywhere that word is, in our case, the book of John, you look up in the concordance, every place in the book of John that the word believe or believed or belief or believing, it'll give you all of those. And you go through your book marking them. An interesting Bible study is to go through and read just the verses that have that word. Now, Jerry, this is not taking a verse out of context. We've talked about where you just take a verse and decide what it means and everything. In fact, this is the opposite in that we're going to read the full context in the next few weeks. We're going to read the full context of the book of the Gospel of John using the word believe. And we're going to talk about today John, and we're going to talk about what the word believe means, because there's some confusion about that. Now, the first thing we need to do when we're going to start a new Bible study, we're going to read the Gospel of John. So the first thing we want to do is say, who is John? Who's writing what we're going to read in the next few weeks? An interesting question is, what do we know off the top of our heads? What do we know about the Apostle John? I'm going to show you some notes that I've got, and then we're going to talk about this, and then we're going to go right into why he wrote this book and what the word believe means. Now, this is a page out of my Bible. At the top of the page, I have taken, this is in my Bible, I've taken some notes, and we're going to talk about John a little bit. Off the top of your head, Jerry, give me, what do you know about the Apostle John? I gave you a hint in the question. What do you know about the Apostle John?
One of the very early beginning apostles.
Okay. All right, good. And he's an apostle. He's one of the 12. Okay. What else do you know about him?
He was like the guard dog. He was one that was out there looking to protect people. And
good. His brother is James, and Jesus gives them a nickname of the Sons of Thunder. So they're very outspoken. Now, some things just to show you up here, just for the sake of time. I'll show you up here, and I'm going to leave this up for a little while so you can take these, you can stop the video and take these notes if you want. He's an apostle. And what's interesting about John, when he writes about himself, he always refers to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. And we'll see why in a second. But in the Gospel of John and 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, he never mentions his own name. And in the book of Revelation, which he also wrote, he mentions his name, but he mentions it in a narrative. He doesn't mention it as something that he's doing or something that's being talked to him. So that shows kind of a humility, but it also shows a style that he writes. So he never mentions himself by name in the Gospel of John. He'll be going along and say all this, James and Peter and Bartholomew and all these guys, and the disciple who Jesus loved. The other thing we know about him is his parents are Salome and Zeb. Now, Salome is Mary's sister. So Salome is Jesus' aunt, okay? And that makes Salome's children first cousins to Jesus. That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. So he is, and a lot of people don't know this, the Apostle John and James are first cousins to Jesus. They would have grown up knowing him. It was family reunions. There's Aunt Mary and her kids, and there were a number of kids. And then there's John and James, the sons of Salome and Zebedee. So they're cousins to Jesus. It's an interesting bracket in that James is the first disciple to be martyred about 44 AD. He is martyred and killed for the faith. John is the last disciple to die, and he's the only disciple to die a natural death. So he lives into the 90s, the late 90s, possibly early 100s, and dies a natural death. He's the only disciple, the only apostle that is not killed for the faith. He's one of the inside three. You remember when Jesus goes someplace and there's going to be something special, he takes three guys with him. His best friend, Peter, and then he's got his two cousins, John and James. So Peter, John, and James are the inside three, kind of the closest disciples to the Lord. Because when he goes someplace, he wants to go someplace private, he doesn't take all 12 disciples. A lot of times he'll take John, James, and Peter. So he's that inside three. He's the closest person to Jesus at the Last Supper. We know that because it says he was leaning right on Jesus' chest, right? Now, the reason for that is he's the youngest disciple. Most scholars believe he's the youngest disciple because, number one, he lived so long. If Jesus starts his public ministry when he's 30 years old, and he's killed and resurrected when he's 33 years old. So let's say that's 33 AD. It's actually a little earlier, but let's say it's 33 AD. John writes the Gospel of John in 85. Most of the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all written in the 40s to 50s. Okay? Yes. So this is 30 years after all three of the other Gospels were written, and comes to 85 AD, and John writes the book. So if Jesus dies and resurrected on 33 AD, this is 52 years later.
I always wonder why there was such a delay there.
Because number one, John was busy. He was the bishop of Ephesus. He was traveling around. He was imprisoned on Patmos. He was persecuted for his belief, but not killed. He's a busy guy, and he's got the other three Gospels. Matthew is written to the Jew. Luke is written to the Greek. Mark is written to the Roman, right? And all three of those are what's called the Synoptic Gospels, and they basically walk through Jesus' life with emphasis on who the audience is and what their interest is going to be. Matthew walks through Jesus' life, and he gives all the fulfillment to the scriptures, and he'll say this fulfilled Isaiah, and this fulfilled this, and this fulfilled this prophecy, things that the Jews wanted to. Luke was a historian, and so it's a historical document of the life of Jesus. And Mark is written to a Roman mind, a Gentile mind, kind of giving the human side of who this Jesus is, that he's a man of action and all the things that Jesus does. And it's interesting that John, at some point in his life, around 85 AD, looks at these Gospels and says, well, that's all well and good, but the church needs something. It needs to clarify who Jesus is for each individual. And so he decides to write an epistle that's not the typical epistle. It's really a sermon. And one of the reasons why he writes the book of John is to give a sermon about who Jesus is and what each of us needs to do about him. All right? And we'll see that as we develop that in just a second. So he is John. He's in the church. He's active in the church in Jerusalem. He later goes to Ephesus and he's a bishop. He's the bishop there. He goes to Patmos and is jailed in Patmos. Then he's released. So we see this kind of biography of who John is, and that gives us a perspective. This is Jesus' cousin who was close to him and lived with him and as a disciple through the whole 3 years ministry, and was very close to him, the disciple who Jesus loved. And he decides to give an insight into who Jesus was and what we all need to do about him. In fact, flip over to John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. John tells us why he writes the book. And John says clearly, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. So this book is not designed to be an exhaustive record of all the miracles Jesus did. He says, but what I have written, these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So what would you sum up the purpose of him writing the book?
One is he wanted to fill in a lot of the blanks.
Okay, but not the blanks in what Jesus did, the works, because he said, I leave off a lot of those. So if we say, hey, in the book of John, there are only a few miracles mentioned because that's not his purpose. His purpose is in verse 31.
Let it know that there was many things that he did in addition to what is written.
Okay, now look at 31.
And but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you have life in his name.
The purpose John writes the book is he wants to write so that you may believe. This book is written to convince you that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He is the Savior. He is Christ, and that's what Christ basically means. He says, I've written these so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So that's what he's going to be writing about. Mm-hmm. And that believing you may have life in his name. Right there is the purpose. And that's why I have up here the annotation that this is the key verse in the Gospel of John. So everything he's going to be writing from the perspective of, I want to convince you who Jesus was and what you need to do about him. And that is believe. And in that believing, you get eternal life. That makes sense? Is that clear?
Yes.
So now, when we go back to John chapter 1, now we're going to do a Bible study on the word believe through the whole book of John. So a question we need to ask ourselves very quickly and get this out of the way before we start looking at verses. What we're going to do is stack the verses. We're going to look at the first place he uses the word believe. What does that verse say? The second place he uses the word believe. What does that verse say? And we're going to see how he moves through this preponderance of teaching of who Jesus is and what you need to do about it. Okay? Now, before we start looking at verses that have the word believe, let's talk about one other thing, and that is this. What does the word believe mean? We have a tendency to read and we just keep on reading through this stuff, but it says believe, and he wrote this. He says, I've written this so that you will believe Jesus is the Christ. Well, what does the word believe mean? Have you given that any thought, Jerry?
Yeah, that's when you accept something as true without evidence or without personally seeing it.
Okay, without personally seeing it is great. The evidence is not personally touched and felt and that sort of thing. Remember doubting Thomas. He said, I won't believe until I put my hand in his and yes. Jesus appears to him and says, okay, go ahead, put your hand in. He sees Jesus and he falls on his knees. And Jesus says, blessed is the one who believes without seeing. So there's that aspect of is to accept something by faith. right? Now I want to show you. I looked up in some Bible software, and I want to share the screen again. I'm going to show you this, and I'll let it all this house cleaning stuff. But here we see the verb for believe in the Greek, which is how he wrote it, is pisteuo. Okay, pisteuo, and what it's a verb, and it means to believe or be persuaded. Right here is where I'm at, or be persuaded, and hence to place confidence in or to trust. It signifies an idea of put confidence in and trust, as in putting a real reliance upon.
Right.
It's not mere credence. In other words, you can't say, okay, Jesus lived, he's a historical figure, and he died on the cross and all that. That's just giving credence to who he was, but it is not believing who he was. And we're going to talk in the future as we go through this book about moving from head knowledge of, I know about Jesus, to heart knowledge of faith in Jesus and knowing him. Now, this is interesting. It says, it goes on and it talks about the other writers of the gospel use that word. Matthew uses the word 10 times. Mark uses it 10 times. Luke uses it 9 times. John uses it 99 times. So in the Gospel of John, the word believe in the book of John is used 99 times. So do you think that's a theme? Yes. So we're going to look at these verses now. If he uses it 99 times, but there aren't 99 verses, because some verses use the word believe 2 or 3 times. We just saw that in chapter 20, verse 31, that he says believe and believe all in the same verse. But we're going to look, and we're going to take next week, we're going to take the word believe and march through the gospel from verse to verse with the word believe. And we're going to see what those verses say about believe and about who to believe and what happens when we believe. And we'll do that starting next week. That makes sense?
It works.
And that's our first study. John writes this book to convince us to believe in Jesus. It's a great book, and we're going to see that starting next week as we stack these words to get a feeling for the flow of the theme. I hope you guys were blessed with this. This is just an introduction to what we're going to be doing. And if this is of interest, hit the subscribe button and then hit the little bell icon. And every time we post a new video, and I post videos Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you won't miss anything. I'm excited about doing this with you.
Yeah, so am I. Yeah, this book has been, it's challenging for me to read because it almost flips around from speaking in first person to second person to third person.
All right, we'll see that. Yeah, that's interesting, because first person is what John is saying about himself and what he's doing, and then second person is he's talking about Jesus and what he's doing, and third person he might be talking to you about what you need to do. And we'll see that starting next week. And until then, God bless you.